All right, so in this video, I'm going to talk about just war theory, which is basically a way of trying to create some sort of moral conduct when it comes to initiating war and also what happens on the battlefield. So it really falls into, just war theory falls into two main categories. Jus ad bellum, which is basically the justice of war. So is there really a just cause? Are the reasons and the means going to be just when we can anticipate what's happening, right? Is it appropriate? Is a war an appropriate response given the situation? So, really thinking about the reasoning and the causality of war. So, the first component is just cause, which is basically, referring to, is this self defense, to this like immediate threat, or is the threat imminent? So it might happen, or it's like there's a good chance it will happen, but we don't 100% know. And oftentimes, just cause falls into the idea of it being a response, or the war being a response to substantial aggression. So bombings, for example, or acts of, state sanctioned violence from another country, something that can violate basic human rights, whether it's within one's own country or something that's happening in another country, such as what happened with the Holocaust. And then the second component of jus ad bellum is that it's sanctioned by proper authority. So it's sanctioned by a state government rather than a random group or a random person or stateless actors. I think this is an interesting one too, because oftentimes this is how a war is distinguished from a revolution or from other acts of political violence. So, what is it about the state government being a proper authority? And I think that's something to think about as well. And then the third component is whether there are right intentions involved. So, are you really responding to substantial aggression, or are you just trying to be greedy and get money or oil from another country? Is there bloodlust involved? Is someone just, really, a tyrannical, egotistical leader and they want to declare war? Or does it have to do with wanting to better something, whether it's for one's own country or another country or the rest of the world? And then the fourth component is that armed conflict, which is war, should be the last resort to a political dispute. So this means that diplomacy and all peaceful means have been used and exhausted, and that this is a last option. War is a last option. And then the fifth one is that it's hard to really predict everything, but from what can be predicted, is the good that's resulting from war, is that proportional to the bad outcomes, to the bad that can happen? So obviously with war, there's always going to be some sort of death, destruction, loss of life, but is the positive benefit going to outweigh all of that death and destruction? And then the last one, the sixth one, is whether there's going to be a reasonable chance of success. So going to war and causing or contributing to the conflict potentially even more, right? Is that worth it? Is it a high probability that you're going to get what you want, basically? So is there a high probability that the war is going to be won? Or does the other opponent have more resources than you? Do they have more allyship with other countries? So those are things to think about with jus ad bellum, justice of war. For this next major component of just war theory, we also have to think about jus in bello, which is justice in war, so the conduct in war. And so here this mainly has to do with what's happening on the battlefield. And the first part, which is typically when we hear the term discrimination, the first component, we think it's like a bad thing because it usually is a bad thing. But this is the ability to discriminate between combatants versus non-combatants. So random civilians walking around, just living their lives, versus people who are in the military who have joined knowing that they could potentially lose their lives during war. And so in war, are you deliberately targeting combatants, or are you indiscriminately targeting whoever you end up seeing? So it's important to distinguish and discriminate between combatants, so military personnel, versus non-combatants, just civilians. The second component is proportionality. So basically, the force that you're using when it comes to the battlefield, when it comes to the war, needs to be proportional to the aims of the war. So you're not overextending the violence, for example, over, something that can seem minor, like some sort of dispute over something. It's, making sure that it's the means are proportionate to the reasoning for the war and the aims of the war. And then the third component is that there are no evil means used. So it's interesting because some people might say, well, there's always evil means used in war. What are you talking about? But from the just war perspective, there are means that are just inherently evil and inherently indiscriminate, such as genocide, ethnic cleansing, and then using some sort of biochemical warfare that targets a large group of people, and that can radically, that can kill people, that will kill people. So refraining from those means, like a nuclear bomb, for example. And then the fourth component is benevolent quarantine. So if you have prisoners of war, soldiers that have basically surrendered themselves, be making sure that you're treating them with human rights and dignity, that you're not torturing them. So those are basically the rules of conduct for just war theory, and just trying to make sure that if you're going to declare a war, that you're doing it in a way that's just and humane, because obviously there's death and destruction in war, but are you doing it for the right reasons, and are you doing it with the correct means?